Julian returned from the border campaign with a scar above his temple and a 5-year chasm in his memory. He did not remember the man or woman he was said to have brought back, only that his head ached with the ghosts of forgotten things. The last thing he recalled with clarity was his own relentless ambition, the sharp-edged dream of a younger man. The news of his state reached Elias, who changed out of his formal attire and went to the Regent's private estate to see the damage for himself. He arrived just in time to hear Julian's voice, crisp and confident, outlining a plan for treason to his inner circle. The nation was unstable, he argued, and the young ruler was weak. It was the perfect time to surround the capital and force the pretender from his seat. As he spoke, his eyes shone with a familiar, determined light, entirely oblivious to the strained and complicated expressions on the faces of his most trusted men. It was Marcus, his captain of the guard, who was pushed forward to speak the difficult truth. He reminded Julian that 5 years ago, he had conquered the capital only to gift it to the current ruler, insisting it was a wedding present. He recounted their many attempts to dissuade him, his single-minded obsession with placing Elias on the throne, and the fact that they now had a child together. Why, after all that, would he want to rebel? Julian's grand vision froze on his face. He processed the words with disbelief. He couldn't fathom why he would hand over his own victory, let alone as a wedding gift. He declared it impossible, scoffing at the idea that he would cede such power for any woman, let alone the empress he barely knew. From his earliest years, Julian had been groomed for power, and the thought of surrendering his destiny to another was antithetical to his very being. Marcus paused, then clarified that Julian's affection was not for the empress, but for the young ruler himself. It was, he insisted, an open and all-consuming love. Before the injury, the entire court knew of Julian's devotion. The ruler's bed had practically become his own territory. He would arrive each night with a theatrical flourish, half undressed to reveal his toned physique, playfully asking Elias to be gentle. He would jest about what the empress might think, a phantom woman who didn't exist because Julian would tolerate no rivals, not even a female mosquito in the royal chambers. But this Julian, the one with no memory, was pure youthful ambition. His face darkened. He stated flatly that he did not love men and would never love that pathetic ruler. Seeing his fury build, Marcus quickly pulled open a series of drawers behind the main desk, revealing their contents as proof. He urged Julian to look before his temper got the best of them all. Julian took a deep breath, his glare fixed on Marcus. Though his memory was fractured, he trusted his own taste. He expected to find rare art, signed documents, items of value. He opened the first drawer. Inside was half of a stale pastry. The second held a simple silk ribbon. The third contained a few dried peppercorns. He frowned, utterly baffled by the collection of junk. The others, however, looked on with weary familiarity. Marcus sighed, explaining that Julian had once called these items proof of their love. He then advised him to stop calling the ruler names, reminding him that he was usually the one acting like a devoted dog in his presence. Julian furiously denied it, accusing Marcus of exploiting their long friendship to spin lies. The force of his presence as Lord Regent silenced the room, yet Marcus persisted, asking if he at least remembered the young prince, the son they had together. The reply was the hiss of a blade being drawn from its decorative sheath on the desk. Julian held the point to Marcus's shoulder, his voice dangerously low, asking if he truly thought he wouldn't kill him. The threat was effective. The men fell silent, and Marcus slowly raised his hands in surrender. Julian gave a cold snort and turned back to his war maps, satisfied. The men, now properly intimidated, ceased their attempts to reason with him, and returned to the grim business of planning how to storm the capital and use Elias's head as a victory banner. Listening from outside the door, Elias felt a chill spread through his limbs. But years on the throne had taught him preparedness. If it was a fight Julian wanted, then a fight he would have. It was Julian who had yielded the throne to him years ago, and Elias had always deferred to him in return, even undergoing a dangerous procedure to bear them a child. This time, he would not need Julian to step aside. He would hold his power on his own merit. The constant refrain of pathetic ruler echoed in his head, fueling a sharp, cold anger. Love could be discarded, but power had to be held. He turned to leave, but a sudden crash shattered the night's silence. His personal aide had stumbled into a large ceramic planter and was now kneeling in terror at his feet. Julian's voice cut through the window. He ordered the person outside to be brought in. With his presence revealed, Elias saw no point in hiding. He walked into the room with measured steps, his eyes sweeping over the conspirators. Recognition dawned on their faces, followed by acute embarrassment. They remembered Julian's past madness for this man. They knew that for all his power and arrogance, Julian had always been deeply insecure, constantly terrified that Elias would leave him. His possessiveness was legendary, channeled into ferocious passion in the bedroom, followed by whispered, pleading questions in the dark. "Do you love me, brother? Will you always love me? You haven't said you love me all day. I think you just want me for my body." His eyes would be bright with a mixture of hope and fear, waiting for reassurance. Once, when Elias was too exhausted to respond immediately, Julian had taken his silence for hesitation, and tears had welled in his eyes, his voice thick with hurt. "You don't care about me as much as you used to." But the man looking at him now held only cold hostility in his gaze. Then Julian's eyes focused on his face, and in the next second, the tips of his ears turned a deep red. He pushed Marcus aside, his gaze locked on Elias. He asked if he was a new strategist, if he was married, if he had a person of interest, and if he could accept a man as his other half. The tense atmosphere evaporated. The question was so absurdly direct it was almost comical. Elias was struck by how much this version of Julian resembled the boy he had first met. Confident, proud, his handsome eyes shining, yet endearingly clumsy when it came to his heart. It was a stark contrast to the slick, seductive Regent who had later learned to use his charm as both a shield and a weapon. Elias answered coolly that he was already spoken for, and that he had a lovely child. He watched the light in Julian's striking eyes dim, his entire posture slumping with disappointment. Julian remarked on how lucky the man's wife must be, his voice strained. He seemed to puzzle over his own reaction, confused as to why the marital status of a stranger would affect him so deeply. Elias added with a faint, mocking smile that his partner loved him very much, though he was currently plotting treason. He then walked toward the large table, and Julian's men parted for him, revealing a detailed map of the capital, complete with hidden tunnels. Elias glanced at Julian and smiled a humorless smile, asking if the tunnels were there to catch the pathetic ruler when he tried to escape. The mention of strategy seemed to jolt Julian back to his purpose. He forced himself to focus, explaining his plan. Elias sat and listened, his expression growing darker as Julian, eager to impress, spoke with increasing passion. He punctuated his points with disdainful snorts, declaring the entire ruling family to be corrupt and worthless, claiming the people were eager for a rebellion led by his own house. Marcus was practically having an aneurysm in the corner, gesturing wildly at his oblivious master. Julian pointed to a specific tunnel on the map, explaining that it was an escape route his family's loyalists had built long ago, a way to get messages to his army. He boasted that the common people trusted his family far more than they trusted the royals. Elias nodded slowly, his gaze complex. A brilliant young general, overwhelmingly popular, with a private army and secret routes into the seat of power. It was no wonder Elias had been wary. Any ruler would have found it impossible to sleep soundly with such a man as his subject. But everything Julian was revealing, Elias already knew. Julian himself had told him 5 years ago, when the city was in chaos. He had used those same tunnels to sneak Elias out of his chambers to safety, knowing that as a disfavored prince from a fallen dynasty, no one else would care if he lived or died. Elias remembered waking up to find Julian standing over him, dressed in full military armor, his expression more serious than he had ever seen it. He had leaned down and pressed a kiss to Elias's forehead. "Brother," he had said, his voice thick with unspoken emotion, "if I die in this battle, you are not allowed to forget me." The memory of Julian's fervent confessions made Elias's heart ache. He had been so good to him. 3 years his junior, yet he had protected him at every turn. He had conquered a kingdom and then handed it to Elias, simply because he was afraid others would look down on him for his background. He had propped him up, content to be the power behind the throne. In the beginning, Elias hadn't even liked men. He had only seen Julian as a tool. But after their first meeting at a state banquet, Julian had pursued him relentlessly, following him around like an eager, beautiful dog, his constant calls of brother both sweet and cloying. Elias had assumed the rumors of his arrogance were exaggerated, until he saw Julian beat another prince to a pulp for calling Elias a low-born nobody. The act was reckless. A public assault on royalty was indefensible, even for someone from a family as powerful as Julian's. He was forced to kneel before the old ruler for punishment. Elias, thinking him a fool, had turned to leave, only to see Julian return moments later, completely unscathed. That was the first time Elias truly understood the meaning of absolute power, and the first time he did not push Julian away. Julian, oblivious to the shift, had been overjoyed, pulling a riding crop from his coat and pressing it into Elias's hand. "Brother, don't be afraid of them. If anyone bothers you again, you use this on them. I'll see the marks and I'll take care of it for you. I'll take the blame for anything." The promise, made with the earnest, clear-eyed sincerity of youth, was one he had kept. Thinking back, Elias realized his own temper had been thoroughly spoiled by Julian's indulgence. His gaze softened as he looked at the man now, so animatedly explaining his plans. Julian paused, noticing his stare. He asked the strategist if he thought the idea was feasible. Pulled from his reverie, Elias asked what he meant. Julian's expression was full of eager anticipation as he declared his plan to hang the little ruler's head from the city gates for all to see, ending the royal line forever. Then he said they could. Elias stood up abruptly, a cold smile on his lips. He remarked that the Lord Regent seemed to hold a rather deep grudge against the royal family. Julian, taken aback, insisted that everyone hated them, that it was only right to overthrow them. Elias simply nodded, said nothing more, and turned to leave. Julian tried to stop him, offering a more merciful alternative, perhaps a simple public execution. Elias's patience snapped. He shot Julian a furious glare and strode from the room. As Julian tried to call after him, his men swarmed him, clamping a hand over his mouth. Marcus followed Elias out into the corridor. He explained that the regent was not himself, that his memory had reverted 6 or 7 years. He begged Elias to understand, insisting that once Julian knew everything, he would change his mind. Elias stopped walking but did not turn. He pointed out that he had arrived incognito, that this was their perfect opportunity to kill him. Marcus's expression was pained. He said that Julian had forgotten, but the love was still there. If he were to harm Elias now, he would surely kill himself when he remembered. Furthermore, he reminded Elias of Julian's standing order. If their opinions ever diverged, all men were to obey Elias first. He swore that Julian's heart was true. Listening silently, Elias suppressed the sting of hurt and told Marcus to inform the regent that he would be waiting for him in the grand hall on the morrow. He could bring whatever tricks he had planned. The next day, Elias sat on the high seat of the throne room, waiting. The Capitol Guard stood silent and imposing, with elite assassins hidden in the shadows. But the morning session was already halfway over, and the Lord Regent had not appeared. Elias spun the signet ring on his thumb, a humorless smile playing on his lips. So Julian intended to make a show of power. It didn't matter. He was prepared for a complete rupture. Just as the sun reached its zenith and the assembly was preparing to close, Julian finally appeared, striding into the hall with an arrogant swagger. He announced that he had a matter to report, his voice loud and defiant. He surveyed the assembled ministers with contempt, inwardly cursing them as a pack of spineless sycophants. The ministers exchanged confused glances. If anyone in the kingdom played the part of the ruler's loyal dog, it was Julian, and he guarded the role jealously. But now he looked at them all with disdain. He paid their strange looks no mind, his gaze sweeping upwards to the throne. He saw Elias, and he froze. A slow blush crept up his neck and stained the tips of his ears. His breathing hitched. Suddenly, the hundreds of unbelievable stories Marcus had told him seemed entirely plausible. That he was not just the regent, but also the father of the little prince. A moment ago, he would have died before believing it. Now, he wished for nothing more than for it to be true. He tore off his formal regent's cap, his expression dead serious. He declared that he would no longer serve as regent without a proper title. Elias raised an eyebrow, asking what he proposed. Julian's voice rang out, firm and clear. He wanted to be the prince consort. A stunned silence fell over the hall. After all this pompous posturing, the late arrival, the robes embroidered with a 5-clawed golden serpent that screamed rebellion. This was his demand? A title? The ministers fought to keep their faces neutral. Elias glanced at Marcus, who stood beside Julian looking utterly exhausted, his mouth twitching with a mixture of exasperation and amusement. Elias looked back at Julian, who was now staring up at him with bright eyes, his ears still crimson. He informed him that such private matters could be discussed later, and if there was no other official business, the court was dismissed. He expected Julian to acquiesce as he always used to, but the Julian of his youth had no patience. He took the ruler's words as a rejection. He abruptly lifted the hem of his robe and sat down on the marble floor, utterly disregarding his image, the setting, and the fact that he was a 30-year-old man with a son. He announced that Marcus had told him he'd been with Elias since he was 18, and that he had been strung along this whole time without a proper title. He had served in Elias's bed for 6 years, he wailed. 6 years. He declared that he wouldn't move until Elias gave him his due. The volume of his voice gave Elias a headache. He pinched the bridge of his nose and waved the stunned ministers away. Once the hall was empty, he descended from the dais and walked slowly toward Julian. He knelt, cupping his chin, a lock of his own hair brushing against Julian's cheek. Julian froze, then instinctively nuzzled against his hand. Realizing what he'd done, his face flushed a deeper red. His long lashes fluttered, his eyes darting away, unable to meet Elias's gaze. He mumbled that such tricks wouldn't work on him, that he was determined to get his title today. He would live in the palace until he did. After all, Marcus had told him he used to live here anyway. Elias studied him, his voice quiet but firm. He asked what happened to the pathetic ruler. Was he no longer plotting a rebellion? Julian's face burned with embarrassment. He claimed he had gotten the dates wrong, and that Marcus's stories were too bizarre to believe at first. Elias arched a brow, asking what made him believe them now. Julian looked down, murmuring shyly that Elias was responsible for him. And besides, it didn't matter which of them was the ruler, since their son would inherit it all anyway. He stumbled over the word son, not yet used to the idea. Thinking of their 3-year-old, Elias had to suppress a laugh. The boy was a stoic little thing who had once sighed with the gravity of an old man that his father, Julian, always ignored him whenever his other father, Elias, was in the room. He was used to it. Julian saw Elias's distraction and his eyes grew moist with unshed tears, his voice trembling as he asked if he was going to get the title or not. Elias returned his focus to the beautiful, pouting man before him. He had never been able to resist him when he looked like this, but for the first time he did not offer comfort. Instead, he asked a serious, pointed question. The consort was forbidden from interfering in politics. If he wanted the title, he would have to surrender his command of the military. Julian stared at him, stunned into silence. Elias felt his heart sink. It was always the same. No man who tasted absolute power would ever willingly let it go. Not even Julian. He remembered a conversation from before Julian's last campaign. Julian had been holding him, murmuring into his hair, "Brother, when I get back, let me be your consort, all right?" Elias, exhausted from their lovemaking, had barely managed a yes. Julian had trembled with excitement, asking if he really meant it. He had confessed his anxieties, how the old ministers were always trying to push other people into Elias's life, and how it drove him mad. Now that they had an heir, he saw no reason for it. He'd grumbled that if he weren't afraid of tarnishing Elias's name in the history books, he would have had them all executed. To which Elias had replied that if he truly wanted to be consort, he would have to give up his military command. Then, too, Julian had fallen silent for a long time. Later, Elias had overheard him with his guards. One of them warned Julian that Elias, as the last of his own royal line, surely hated Julian for slaughtering his relatives. He suggested Elias didn't even like men and was only using him. A dangerous quiet had fallen. Julian's aura turned glacial. The guard pressed on, pointing out that Elias had been systematically replacing officials with men who were not loyal to Julian's faction. Julian had cut him off, his voice like ice. "I am in the royalist faction. What faction are you in?" He then dismissed the man from his service. Even then, he had been too proud to accept the idea that Elias did not love him. Before that campaign, Julian had been consumed by insecurity, constantly seeking reassurance. "Brother, you do love me, right? Are my muscles not appealing anymore? Is it that new scholar? Is he taller than me? More handsome? Why aren't you saying anything?" The military command was the one thing that gave him security, the one chain he had to bind Elias to him. But it was also the thing that made Elias feel most like a prisoner. A ruler with no army was a puppet. And so he had asked again, and now he waited for the answer, his heart a cold, heavy stone in his chest. Perhaps their current precarious balance was for the best. In love, but wary of each other. He sighed and began to pull his hand away, but Julian suddenly grabbed him by the waist, pulling him into his lap. Julian's gaze was hot, fixed on his lips. He murmured, asking if this was an attempt at seduction. It wouldn't work, he declared. Only a title would suffice. Elias, lost in thought, realized he had been unconsciously biting his lip. But years with this man had stripped him of any shyness. He leaned in closer, their noses almost touching, and whispered, asking if he was sure it wouldn't work. Julian said nothing, the red on his ears spreading across his face. He trembled slightly and leaned in to kiss him, but just as their lips were about to meet, a small, clear voice came from the doorway. "Daddy, did you bring me anything fun?" Elias immediately pushed Julian away and went to the door to greet the small boy. The child, Leo, formally dismissed his attendance before trotting over. "Father, what were you doing?" He looked from Elias to Julian, then pointed. "Is Daddy crying again? Shame on him." The small, soft child was a perfect miniature of Julian. He planted himself between them, adding that Daddy didn't look good when he cried, and that Father might not want him anymore if he kept it up. Elias frowned. Julian was already sensitive enough without his own son saying such things. He wondered who had been teaching the boy such words. He expected Julian to gently reprimand him, but instead, Julian's face hardened. He looked at the boy and said, "So this is the prince you gave me, brother? He doesn't look anything like you. Not cute at all. Give me another one who looks just like you." His eyes, wet and pleading, turned to Elias. Leo's mouth puckered, ready to cry, but Julian pinched his cheeks. "Don't cry. I don't want to hear it." Elias was about to intervene, but Julian shot him a look that clearly said, "Don't you dare take his side. I'm your baby, too." Julian stayed in the palace, spending the rest of the day teasing his son until the boy fell asleep exhausted. That night, he shuffled awkwardly up to Elias. He asked where he was supposed to sleep. Elias, still annoyed at him for making their son cry all afternoon, replied acidly that he could sleep on his hand. He expected Julian to retreat, but instead, the man's entire face and neck flushed crimson. He kept raising and lowering his hands, a look of intense, flustered determination on his face as he reached for the belt at his waist. Suddenly, Elias understood and felt his own face grow hot. Not that kind of sleeping. It seemed the man's lecherous nature was innate, even in his youth. Elias closed his eyes, calming his own irritation. Julian was now mentally 9 years his junior and had been coddled his whole life. He needed patience. He opened his eyes and saw Julian looking lost and vulnerable. He sighed, took his hand, and led him to the bathing chambers. This version of Julian was far more innocent than the man he had become. His beautiful eyes watched, wide and uncertain, as Elias slowly undid his clothes, piece by piece. Julian's breathing grew heavy, his gaze fixed on Elias's face. When he was finally bare, he reached out to undress Elias in turn, but Elias stepped back. He told him he had already bathed, and that he should take his time. Then, with a small smile, he leaned in, gave him a soft kiss on the lips, and left. Later that night, drifting in a hazy sleep, Elias felt someone climb into his bed. He woke with a start, wondering who would be so bold. Then he recognized the familiar scent and relaxed, unconsciously shifting back into the curve of Julian's body and falling back asleep. He was completely unaware of the man behind him, stiff as a board, who got up multiple times that night for a cold wash. The next morning, he awoke to something hard under his head. He reached for it and his fingers closed around a heavy, palm-sized metal object. It was the command seal, gleaming coldly in the morning light. Julian's bright voice sounded from beside him. "The military command you wanted. Was the me from before so stingy that he wouldn't give it to you?" He must not have loved you as much as I do. The amnesiac Julian loved to compete with Marcus, with his own son, and now, apparently, with his former self. He grinned and wrapped an arm around Elias's waist. Don't love him. Love me. Elias looked at him quietly. He asked if this was a genuine offer. Julian's eyes shone as he nodded. Anything you want, if I have it to give, it's yours. Genuinely. Looking at his earnest face, Elias felt a complex wave of emotion. It didn't feel right to take advantage of such pure devotion. Julian seemed to read his thoughts. He insisted that he wasn't into playing games, that the old him was just too insecure. He declared that he had nothing to be insecure about. He was young, strong, and had a great body. He dared Elias to look at him and not be moved. Then his tone hardened. But you had better not change your mind, or I'm afraid I might get angry enough to want to hurt someone. He immediately looked down, flushing shyly. I'm not usually so violent, he mumbled. Elias just made a soft sound of acknowledgement, understanding the bravado of a young man trying to impress the person he loves. Now that we have an agreement, let's write the decree, Julian said, his eyes sparkling. The one making me prince consort. He watched Elias expectantly. You won't go back on your word, will you? You promised to give me and our son a proper title. He put on a pitiful expression, like a man scorned. Daddy, our son already has a title. You're the one who doesn't, Leo announced from the doorway, having arrived for his morning lessons. He was prim and proper in front of the servants, but Julian saw the old soul in the little boy's eyes and couldn't resist pinching his cheek. You little brat, always trying to one-up your old man. He then eagerly ran to prepare the ink and scroll, presenting the brush to Elias, not even caring that he was still in his sleeping robes. He watched with breathless anticipation as Elias wrote. Before the ink was even dry, Julian snatched the decree, blew on it repeatedly, and tucked it carefully inside his coat, treasuring it more than he ever had the command seal. For a time, Elias thought Julian's memory would never return, and he found that he didn't mind. This Julian was refreshingly direct. He had taken the decree and faced down the entire assembly of ministers. When they objected, he had simply stated that he had a child with the ruler, so their opinions were irrelevant. He told them it was a family matter and none of their business. When one minister threatened to commit suicide in protest, Julian had tossed his own sword at the man's feet and dared him to do it, saying it would conveniently open up a position for one of his own men. His attitude was so outrageously arrogant it left them speechless. But then, one day, everything came back. He reverted to the sly, seductive Regent, though now with a new layer of anxiety. Brother, did you really mean it when you said you liked the other me better? Are you going to leave me for him? Elias was exasperated. He reminded Julian that it was still him. It's not the same, Julian wailed. His handsome face crumpled as if he were about to cry. He's a schemer. He just regifted my own idea. I was going to give you the command seal all along. I was just waiting until after the campaign. And then I lost my memory. But you're not allowed to like him. He was back to his old tricks, whining and seeking comfort in Elias's arms. To save his own aching back, Elias quickly soothed him. But just when he thought he had appeased him, Julian's personality would shift again in the middle of the night. A different voice, younger and sharper, would whisper in the dark, "Brother, you promised you only liked him. So what about me?" Elias froze. He finally understood. Julian hadn't just regained his memories. He had developed a second personality. One was a cat, the other a dog. But both of them, it seemed, loved him completely. From the journal of Prince Leo, "I am the sole heir to the throne, but I am not happy." My father is a man, and my other father is also a man. They are always too busy to pay attention to me. Father Elias is always complaining that his back hurts. Whenever he does, Father Julian becomes very obedient. I saw this and decided to try it. I went to Father Julian and told him my back was sore, just like Father Elias does. His face went black. My bottom was sore for a week. When I was older, I understood why I had two fathers. My royal tutor said it was against all tradition and that I should not learn from their example. I looked at Father Elias. Then I looked at the tutor's handsome grandson. He smelled nice. The tutor was right. I must not go against tradition. And the tradition of my family, the unorthodox union of the lines of Julian and Elias, was to do whatever I wanted.